The challenge is that we don't have unlimited resources, and the budget is what it is. Our debt is, $37 trillion going on 40, and no prospect of rising defense budgets. Yes, I'd want to have a much bigger defense budget to help us fight all these threats, but given the political realities, given where we stand, we do have to prioritize. And look, Admiral Papar, the head of Indo-PACOM, last year at the Halifax conference, you may recall, said a lot of the weapon systems that are going to Ukraine are impacting my readiness in the Indo-Pacific, particularly Patriot interceptors, some of the other air defense assets. Not everything, not M1 Abrams tanks, not Humvees, not Bradley fighting vehicles that we don't need in the Indo-Pacific, but some of that stuff, that we only have so much of it. We don't have the production capacity we used to have during the Cold War. We're not going to get it back anytime soon, particularly with the time frame that I worry about with regards to potential conflict with China. So we have to prioritize. This is not the world that we wish it to be. It's the world that we have.
Dmitri Alperovitch, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Roger. Great to be on with you.
Well, we're thrilled that you're at Reaganism, and while there's so much to discuss with you, of course, you are the co-founder and chairman of the Silverado Policy Accelerator. Of course, you were the co-founder of CrowdStrike, one of the world's largest cybersecurity companies. We're here today to discuss something else because you are the author of The World on the Brink. This is how America can beat China in the race for the 21st century. So the book is actually the focus of the discussion today. Of course, it no doubt pulls upon your professional experience at CrowdStrike and, of course, what you do at the Silverado Policy Accelerator. But why don't we just start with the title of the book and the book itself, World on the Brink. Still pretty much a very sort of an apt title, even though you published this a year plus ago.
That's right. Well, look, the premise of the book is that this is a new Cold War that we're in with China, Cold War II. And it actually is remarkably similar to the first Cold War that President Reagan, of course, finished during his term and won. And the premise is that we got to do a lot of things to make sure that we win the second Cold War. I believe actually China is much weaker on almost every measure than the Soviet Union ever was, except economics. But we are much stronger now than we were even during the first Cold War. But this will take a lot of effort. Neil Ferguson, another great historian friend of mine, says that nowhere is it written in the history annals that America always has to win Cold Wars. So without a lot of effort, this can be lost. And unfortunately, we've been distracted for way too long, for many decades now. And the Chinese have been squarely focused on this objective of first ejecting us out of the Indo-Pacific, starting with Taiwan, and then ultimately cementing their global leadership. And we got to get back into the fight and make sure we defeat them.
So you write at the start of the book that America still has no equal in the world. It's just been playing the wrong cards and following the wrong strategy. Now, this was published, as I mentioned before, in 2024, certainly before President Trump returned to office in January of 2025. I love the optimism. I love the confidence in the United States of America. Of course, here at the Reagan Institute on Reaganism, that will surprise no one. But yet, there is this embedded critique that we're playing the wrong cards. How do you feel things look now with the Trump administration? It's different in almost every respect than his predecessor, President Biden. Do you think we're playing the right cards right now? In other words, if the book were to be published now, would you write the same sentence?
I would. I still think that we haven't really appreciated that this is a new Cold War. As we speak, President Trump is talking about getting a new trade deal done with China, even though during the first term when he got that trade deal, phase one deal, the Chinese immediately started cheating on it. Even if he manages to get a second trade deal done, I guarantee you the Chinese will cheat on it again. And we're still not as focused on this geopolitical confrontation as we were during the first Cold War, right? When you think about the first Cold War, everything from our military, from our geostrategic partnerships to our economy was really oriented towards the defeat of communism, the defeat of the Soviet Union. We don't have that focus now, unfortunately. We're too insular. We're too focused on, frankly, other conflicts that are important but not as critical as making sure that we deter China from invading Taiwan, we deter China from challenging us in the Indo-Pacific and beyond. And that's my main critique of numerous administrations now, going back probably to the Nixon era, frankly, that have not focused on China as a singular threat.
Let's debate that a little bit, because you and I have chatted before, and I think I view the world in a very similar fashion that you do. But I do think we've been playing some of the right cards. And even things that perhaps maybe at first blush don't seem like they're directly related to China, I think we've actually are realizing some potential wins. You're right to focus on the trade deal. I would throw in the allowance by the Trump administration of the NVIDIA H20 chips to be exported to the People's Republic of China is probably not playing the right card as it stands right now. But let's go zoom out and look at this geopolitically. If we think about the axis, we think about Ukraine, and you're a big supporter of Ukraine and rolling back Russian aggression. You think about Iran and the havoc they wreaked, past tense, against Israel and U.S. interests more broadly in the Middle East. You could say, at least let's start in the Middle East, that the success of Israel and the success of the United States with Operation Midnight Hammer has actually not only had a material impact on U.S. national security interests in that region, that is the Middle East, but also vis-a-vis the People's Republic of China. It's taken one threat out, it's weakened the axis, and I think it's restored a level of deterrence that will make Xi reconsider what the United States will and will not be willing to do. And not to mention the effectiveness of such a military operation to demonstrate that we not only have the toys, but we know how to use them. Give me your take on that. Do you disagree with that?
Not really in the broader sense. Look, I was supportive of Operation Midnight Hammer. I thought it was it needed to be done. Iran was way too close to developing a nuclear weapons capability. We had to roll them back. It was very successful, I think, in accomplishing that. I'm less of a linkage person where, I think that one conflict in one part of the world affects another. I think that the domino theory was probably widely discredited during the first Cold War, and I think it's still not the case today that, as Xi or Putin or any of these leaders look around the world, that they necessarily care a whole deal about what happens halfway around the world versus their backyard. And I speak as someone who thinks that we should help Ukraine, who thinks that we should deter Iran. I'm not sort of the primacist that the only thing we should be doing is confronting China. I just think that a lot of the things that we do in other conflicts don't necessarily directly impact China, and vice versa. For the people that say, to defeat Xi, or to deter Xi, I should say, we should make sure that we win in Ukraine. I think we need to win or help Ukraine at least not get defeated in its conflict against Russia for its own reasons, for European security, which is still vital to the United States and our interests. But the idea that it matters that much to Xi versus what happens in his own backyard, I just don't buy that premise. And let me give you a hypothetical. Let's say that Ukraine is defeated. Hopefully that doesn't happen. But that we take every single soldier that we have in Europe, all of the enabling capabilities, all the weapon systems, and we dump them in the Indo-Pacific, right, in Japan, in the Philippines, surrounding China. You can't tell me that she's going to look at that and say, great, American allies defeated in Europe, now I've got a free hand to go against Taiwan. In fact, you'll say, no, my situation is considerably worse because now they have many more forces in the region. I'm not arguing we should do that, by the way. Again, I'm not the person that thinks that the only thing that matters is China, but I do think it's the main thing. And, as the quote goes, the main thing about the main thing is the main thing. And we gotta focus on China a lot more than we're doing.
Let's debate this for more. I haven't done it in a while on the show. And I think perhaps it may appear that we'll debate in the grays and the nuance, but actually I think it's important to refine thinking on this and the choices we should be making as a country, certainly as it relates to our security choices. And I take the point that if we're exposed and vulnerable in the Indo-Pacific because we've won Ukraine by exhausting all our stockpiles, then we're vulnerable there. That's not what we want. But at the same time, I'm sure you'll acknowledge that this axis, and the reason why we think about what the cooperation between Iran, Russia, and China is not just about sort of this ideological alignment, and there is a common thread of hatred against the United States, but also it allows sort of operational and strategic alignment that if they're all of equal strength and one gets attacked, and there's a flashpoint in one area, it provides an opportunity for the other actor to create a vulnerability right elsewhere and make it more complicated. So what I'm trying to get at is that if you remove Iran off the table, right, it means that in the event there would be this flashpoint in Taiwan or elsewhere in the Indo-Pacific, you've reduced the likelihood that the United States could get attacked from the rear by an Iran that is cooperating, perhaps coordinating with the People's Republic of China. And similarly, as it relates to Russia, to the extent that Russia is bogged down and attriting manpower in the Ukraine fight, right, it means that they couldn't exploit a vulnerability or create a vulnerability if the United States was engaged with China. All that is to say is that a weakened Iran and a weakened Russia advantages the United States vis-a-vis China.
No argument there, Roger.
Yeah, and I think that's a key point in terms of the axis and why we think about from a national defense strategy standpoint, we need to be able as a country to manage three key regions in the world. And I think President Trump has advanced that.
Because you also have North Korea, of course, right, which is not going away either.
True.
The problem, I think, is really prioritization and how many resources do we have, right? For decades now, we've had the policy of being able to only fight on one front at a time and maybe keep the other one at bay while we engage in this fight. There's now questions of whether we even have the capacity, given the deterioration, frankly, in our military capacity over the last couple of decades with these continuing resolutions and inability to plan weapons procurements over long term, and frankly, the buildup in our adversaries' capabilities, primarily China, whether we can still do that. And this is really the problem is, in the ideal world, of course, we would want to defeat all of our adversaries just, on the basis of we want to have fewer adversarial countries that are challenging our position on the global sphere, right? Nothing to even do with China. The need to make sure that Iran does not create a nuclear weapon is just based on the basis that we want a more peaceful Middle East and an actor that's not engaged in terrorist activity and supporting all kinds of nefarious forces in the region. That alone is reason enough to do Midnight Hammer. And we don't need to drag China into it, similar with Russia and Ukraine and so forth. The challenge is that we don't have unlimited resources, and the budget is what it is. Our debt is, $37 trillion going on 40, and no prospect of rising defense budgets. Yes, I'd want to have a much bigger defense budget to help us fight all these threats, but given the political realities, given where we stand, we do have to prioritize. And look, Admiral Papar, the head of INDOPACOM, last year at the Halifax conference, you may recall, said a lot of the weapon systems that are going to Ukraine are impacting my readiness in the Indo-Pacific, particularly Patriot interceptors, some of the other air defense assets. Not everything, not M1 Abrams tanks, not Humvees, not Bradley fighting vehicles that we don't need in the Indo-Pacific, but some of that stuff, that we only have so much of it. We don't have the production capacity we used to have during the Cold War. We're not going to get it back anytime soon, particularly with the time frame that I worry about with regards to a potential conflict with China. So we have to prioritize. This is not the world that we wish it to be. It's the world that we have.
So let's unpack that, and we'll engage in more debate here. This is a fun one for our listeners and viewers. We're with Dmitri Alperovitch, author of World on the Brink, How America Can Beat China in the Race for the 21st Century. I think it's a lot of the assumptions that your arguments draw from should be contested or at least debated a little bit here. I mean, on the one hand, you're very optimistic about the United States. You write that America is more powerful than it appears on the surface. I agree with that. But at the same time, we have to, you argue, accept the reality. You write, nor frankly should we need to increase that defense budget. Instead, we'll have to make tough choices about what weapons, platforms, munitions we can afford to build, operate, and maintain. You talk about the defense budget. President Trump has now, through the reconciliation process, will have a significant increase in the defense budget. It'll be $1 trillion defense budget. Congress is adding even more. The notion that the defense budget is not going up doesn't have to be true. And it isn't true for the fiscal year. If you talk to Secretary of Defense and others, they would like to see it continue. Now, politics in this country are what they are and unpredictable, and the budgets require yearly, if not monthly or weekly or daily engagement to make sure the outcomes are one that advantages the United States, certainly as it relates to our national defense. But we don't have to accept that budgets are going to decline or even stay at this level. And I think what we're seeing so far is that we're going to see it go up. The same thing about industrial capacity. What we have seen, and you've seen this, you're involved in this through your policy accelerator, there is a big push to accelerate industrialization, to reindustrialize, to use manufacturing, advanced manufacturing processes that we haven't used before, certainly as it relates to the defense industrial base. Why not use this moment in a timely fashion to emphasize what we could be, as opposed to making an argument that we have to deal with the way it is right now?
Look, I agree with you, Roger. We should be doing all of that. The issue is just the timeline. I think we're running out of time. I believe that China may try to invade Taiwan as soon as late 2028, early 2029. That's just 3 years away, right? You're not going to reform the defense industrial base. You're not going to massively increase our output in those 3 years. It's just physically impossible. If we had a decade, I would absolutely agree with you. And we should be doing a lot of that and faster, but we still have lots of issues with permitting, with the way that Congress authorizes procurements of weapon systems. They don't want to give long-range contracts. The reason why we can't build more than 2 submarines a year in this country is not because even we don't have the capacity to do so, but because Congress wants to buy them one at a time. And as a result, I talked to these defense contractors. They can't procure parts for it, even though they know that they'll have one a year for the next decade. Congress actually, by law, tells them you cannot buy individual parts, pre-buy them for the next 10 years, even though it would be cheaper. It would secure a supply chain. You need to buy them one at a time, right? Well, guess what? Because a lot of these parts are custom made, you have a long delay. There's a disruption in the supply chain. There's ripple effects through the entire program, right? That's why so many of these things are so artisanal that we can't manufacture them at scale. I wish we could fix that easily. Reforming Congress is perhaps the most challenging thing we can do in this country, and how they operate, unfortunately.
I think those are all descriptive of the current reality, but there's some things afoot, and no doubt you're aware of them too in your work. In terms of the multi-years, right? Congress only appropriating one year at a time. They've made allowance, particularly as it relates to multi-years for submarines. So our advantage, comparative advantage as it relates to China, has been our SSNs, our fast boat submarines, and those are not being produced at the pace that Congress has authorized and appropriated because of the industrial base issues that you've shared. However, there are really exciting developments. I'm sure you know, Hadrian is one company that I visited recently where they're actually potentially going to be building those parts, or they should be, because they can get parts built quickly. And so there is going to be some sort of disruption in terms of the tooling and manufacturing that goes to our most important vessels. Here's where I think may bounce this off you. This window of vulnerability between now and 28, 29, I think that's right. Every day, and we'll talk about your argument in the book that China must be deterred and what we have to do to ensure that Xi wakes up every day and says, not today. We'll talk about that. But it's not like, and this really does borrow from the first Cold War. This is actually Reagan's language. We don't have to match the PRC bullet for bullet, gun for gun, tank for tank, ship for ship. If that is our approach, we will not prevail, given our industrial capacity, given the resources it takes, and given how far ahead the People's Republic of China is, the PLA is on that front. But I wonder, my sense is that we could probably do enough with the right investments, if we were a little bit optimistic of what we can achieve, in deterring the PRC from a Taiwan scenario and do what's required elsewhere in other regions across the world. Yes, it requires some prioritization, but I think it also requires some robust level of investment and prioritization of the overall issue set by our national leaders, starting with the president.
Yeah, look, I hope that's right, and I certainly agree with you that we should be doing all those things. And by the way, you're right. We don't need to match them in number of ships, for example. We do need a lot of munitions, a lot more than we currently have. Right now, when you look at their missile and rocket force, they can absolutely overwhelm Taiwan. There's not enough air defense and interceptors in the world, in the Western world, to help stop that. Right, we're far behind there. We don't have enough torpedoes. We don't have enough smart underwater drones that can sink that fleet. We need to ramp that up significantly. I just worry that, as Donald Rumsfeld once said, you go to war with the army you've got, not the army you wish to have. This is a situation we have today. If we can fix all those issues in 3 years, and I'm certainly working really hard to try to get them to be fixed, and I know the Reagan Institute is doing that too, and you and many others. But the reality is that if this conflict, God forbid, happens in that time frame, we're not going to be ready. We're just too far behind. So that's why I'm arguing for the prioritization now. If all those things do come to pass and we get those reforms to happen much quicker, then we can talk about how we, get more engaged elsewhere in the world because we have that extra capacity. I'm just talking about the reality we face today.
Yeah, and I think the reality as we face today is as you describe, but it's also about making that an enduring reality, which is my concern, right? I mean, there's this outlook that's there, certainly in sort of the restrainer community. Certainly it's in the isolationist community, none of which I would associate you with and your outlook at all. But there's this notion that reality is such, and as a result, we no longer can lead in the Middle East. We no longer can lead NATO with our allies in Europe. And frankly, I think President Trump has his own stamp, as he has his own stamp on almost everything, as it relates to American leadership in the world, which is allies need to step up first, and the U.S. will support. Uber example is Israel vis-a-vis Iran's nuclear weapons program. Israel stepped up first, carried out that strike. The U.S. came in afterwards and finished it up. But even with the most recent NATO summit and the 5% to GDP commitment to defense of our NATO allies, now that's an example where President Trump's saying you got to step up, and they did. And President Trump left that summit happier than any other NATO summit he had attended. And then you fold into that the approach to Ukraine, which actually gets to a policy I would expect you to support, which is we're not going to go ahead and use Patriot batteries from our stockpile, not that we have a stockpile, from our inventory. We're going to actually have the EU, NATO countries pay for them. They come to the United States, U.S. sells it to them, and then it's deployed into Ukraine. There's still a bit of an industrial capacity issue there that the manufacturers are working on. But that does offer a framework where the U.S. can maintain its position in those key regions in the world and at the same time potentially have the necessary force presence, force structure in the Indo-Pacific. There's one other X factor here, Dmitri, which I'd love you to comment on, which is President Trump. And, between now and 2028, and it's interesting you say 28, 29, because that is the year President Trump, 29, would leave office. He will, of course, be in office throughout 2028. And he has said publicly, actually before he's elected president, you and I chatted about this in an interview with the Wall Street Journal editorial board. What are you going to do if Xi carries out a blockade of Taiwan? And Trump's like, well, he's not going to do that. And ultimately, they pressed on the question. He goes, he won't do that because he knows I'm effing crazy. And it was a greatest sort of encapsulation of Trump's one-man deterrence capability. How does that factor into your analysis?
I actually think he's absolutely right. I think, first of all, the Chinese are not ready. There's a lot of talk about 27. I think there's a lot of misinterpretation of what that date really means. What the U.S. intelligence community said is that Xi has given the order for the PLA to be ready to invade by 2027. It doesn't mean that he will. It doesn't mean that he's penciled a date certain in the calendar. He set a sort of line in the sand that I want you to be ready. It makes sense that he would do that because, as you know, Roger, if you don't give any government agency a deadline, they'll never meet it. So you need to put some sort of date on it for them to meet. 27 is a very symbolic date. It's the 100th year anniversary of the establishment of the PLA, the People's Liberation Army. And it's also the year of his likely re-election to the unprecedented fourth term as the leader of the Chinese Communist Party. So for him to go in front of the party Congress in October or November of that year and say, I, Xi Jinping, for the 100th year anniversary of our military, has developed the capability to invade Taiwan at a time of our choosing is a very powerful thing. It doesn't mean that he's going to do that year. I think that year, A, they probably won't meet that deadline anyway. They're quite behind. And two, given that it is the year of his reelection, even though it's not a democracy, there is an election that happens amongst the party elites. He needs to make sure that he's secured all the support that he needs and that he removes any potential challenges, as he's been doing really since 2012. when he first came to power. So it's not an ideal time to invade. After that, after he gets through his election in 28, I think the window starts opening up, perhaps in the later time period in 28, second half. But I do think he'll probably at that point wait out Trump because, as Trump says, he is effing crazy, and you never know what he's going to do. He might go to war. He might, decouple. He might do nothing. You just can't predict. So I think you'll wait out for the next president and perhaps or potentially do it during the transition period. So I do think sort of late 28, 29 is when he'll be ready to do so. He'll be free from his distractions. And then he'll look at the reality of who is in leadership in the U.S., obviously, but also in Taiwan. They've got elections also in 2028. Potentially a new leader may come into place that may be more accommodating to China if the opposition, the KMT, wins there. So it's going to be conditions dependent. But you do have, I think, a potential end date in 2032 because his fourth term, assuming he goes for it, will expire in 2032. He'll be 79 at that point. And in the Chinese system, they don't tend to elect their leaders into their 80s. Who knows, health issues and other realities may intervene. So I think going into that fourth term, he'll be thinking, this might be my last, and I need to finish the job. And the top of the priority list is Taiwan. So that 28 through 2032 period is, I think, going to be one of the most dangerous 4-year periods we've had, certainly in that region, perhaps globally, in a long time.
Now, there are people out there that are skeptical as to whether or not Taiwan really is relevant to the United States. We poll on this, as you know, at the Reagan Institute. There's great support for Taiwan by the American people. It's up there with Israel and Ukraine and not quite as high as the United Kingdom and Australia, but really strong affinity. And Taiwan's a good guy in the eyes of the American people. We see that. But there is a view that, hey, we're not going to go to war over this island. And there's lore coming out of the White House that President Trump, when asked about Taiwan or discussing China, he looks at the map and sees this big old China and this little tiny island Taiwan, the second largest economy in the world, largest military in the world, modernized military in the world, nuclear power. You can go on and on. Why would we do this? Is the implication of him pointing to the maps and highlighting the differences. And you add to that this moment where the word freedom, free societies, that's not an animating concept for Trump administration foreign policy. We've had other so-called realist administrations. They clearly fit within that construct. And there's certainly a point of view that perhaps President Trump is somebody who really understands and thinks about the world in terms of spheres of influence. And maybe President Trump's view of China is that sphere of influence should extend to Japan or the Republic of Korea or Australia, but may extend beyond Taiwan. What's your sense of sort of the political outlook of the United States towards Taiwan and whether the American people can get behind Taiwan's security?
Yeah, this is an issue that I really try to develop to a great extent in the book. And you're right to mention maps. I think maps are critical. Geography matters. And in the book, we have a different map of the region. So typically the map you see is, the big landmass that is China, a tiny speck of land right next to it that is Taiwan. And, as President Trump would say, why does anyone care? But if you rotate the map, as we do in the book, and you sort of put China on top, looking out at the vastness of the Pacific Ocean in front of it, you see the dilemma that presents to them because they feel certainly that they're completely contained by U.S. allies and U.S. military bases, right? When they look to their far east, they see the Korean Peninsula, half of which is South Korea, with 28,000 American troops, air bases, some naval installations. Further down, you have the Japanese islands, the headquarters of the U.S. Naval 7th Fleet and the Marine Expeditionary Forces on Okinawa. On the other side, you have the containment of the islands in South China Sea. Many of them are allies, and in particular the Philippines, where for the first time since the early 90s, we're back. We're establishing military bases, getting access to 8 military bases, and even last year deployed and still keep the intermediate range ballistic missile system, the Typhoon, that can range China, which the Chinese are incredibly allergic to. And then in the center of this first island chain, the sort of the gateway to the Pacific is Taiwan, that is facing most of the Chinese ports, viewed as a cork that can contain China within the East China Sea and the South China Sea that it borders with the Philippines there. So if China is able to take Taiwan, not only is it going to be able to dominate the semiconductor industry, and people talk about 90% of the most advanced chips being produced by Taiwan, but also 40% of all chips, period, being produced there, so critically important. But it's also the influence in the most important region of the world, and uncorking China and allowing it to now challenge the U.S. sea-based lines of communications to Japan, to Korea, even to the Philippines. And I believe if China succeeds in taking Taiwan, it would now flip the tables where it would no longer be contained, but it would actually essentially eject the United States all the way out to Guam and Hawaii, and prevent us from being part of Asia in a significant way, where, of course, you have most of the world's populations, most of the supply chains, most of the economic growth. That would be an incredible coup for China and hugely detrimental to the United States. So I ultimately believe that this is where the battle is going to be, right? We had this in the first Cold War, this outpost of freedom in the heart of Eastern Europe, in the heart of Soviet-occupied, really, Eastern Europe, West Berlin, right? When you look at the map, anyone would say, why does West Berlin matter, right? It's surrounded by East Germany. It's indefensible. We should just give it up. But yet, numerous presidents, starting with President Truman and the Berlin airlift, continuing to Eisenhower and Kennedy, and ultimately, of course, through Reagan, said, no, we're going to defend West Berlin. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, as President Reagan famously said. We viewed it as critically vital to both our credibility, to our allies in Western Europe, and our defense for them, but also as a sign of our commitment to the defense of Europe. Similarly, Taiwan plays that role, I believe, in the Second Cold War, and losing that is not just about chips. I don't think you can tell any American to go die for semiconductors, right? Even though they're so incredibly important to the global economy, to the U.S. economy. But it is about U.S. dominance in the region, U.S. position as the world's preeminent superpower, and losing that, and particularly losing that to China, will change the way of life, not just over there, but here in America. And that's why Taiwan is so critical.
Really well argued, and a lot of points I agree with. But someone could argue, hey, Dmitri, you just basically put forward a domino theory argument for the United States off of Taiwan, and that the same theory that you were critical of as used during the first Cold War.
Touche, Roger. I would say that geography matters. So the reason Taiwan is important is not just because it's one of the dominoes, it's the dominoes that all the other ones are based on. And, look at the map. Our routes of communication to Japan, to Korea, to the Philippines, would be easily intervened by Chinese forces if they're able to build submarine bases. They don't have access to deep water ports right now on the Chinese mainland, a huge issue for them. Their submarines, as they're traversing the Taiwan Strait and going through in the space between Taiwan and Japan and Taiwan and the Philippines to get out to the Pacific, can be easily tracked by the U.S. Navy with our sensors there, our submarines. And that they would be able to escape that containment if they can build submarine bases on the eastern side of Taiwan, sonar installations. They would now impact our ability to operate freely in that region and really put into question, I believe, the ability for us to defend Japan should China attack it, defend Korea, defend the Philippines, would make it considerably more difficult for us. General Douglas MacArthur called Taiwan, or Formosa as it was called at the time in 1950, an unsinkable aircraft carrier. Mm-hmm. It mattered vitally to the United States back in 1950. It still matters today because of that geography.
Let's shift now, for closing out the conversation, to revisit your point of view, which with others share, but it's a debated point of view, that we're in a second Cold War. And I tend to think of it that way as well. I think there's more to gain by that analogy than there is to lose. although very important differences between a Cold War between the United States and the People's Republic of China than what we saw in through the 1980s in a Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. But one of the things I was curious about after reading the book is what the end state looks like from your point of view. Where do we want to take this thing? And if you use Cold War I as a construct, you had a number of different approaches. And three that I'll articulate. Containment is one, where we're just sort of tried to keep the Soviet Union hemmed in, not to allow them to continue to expand its reach, however defined. Two, you have a détente, which was a sort of more benign form of containment. It reduced the sort of confrontation of containment and allowed for some sort of framework of coexistence and areas of cooperation. Of course, that was led by Kissinger during the Nixon years and Ford years, and then Carter continued it in his own framework. And then you have rollback, which ultimately was how Reagan's approach to the Cold War played out and was what he sought. And it led to the fall of the Soviet Union, as we know. What is your thinking about where the Cold War II should go? Containment, rollback, détente, or something else?
Yeah, I don't think it's détente. I do think that it's a mixture of containment and rollback. And look, one interesting thing about the Cold War is you can make now a credible argument 30 plus years after the supposed end of the Cold War is that maybe the Cold War didn't end, right? The Soviet Union collapsed and Eastern Europe got liberated, but Russia, the main contingent of the Soviet Union, still presents as big of a threat to us in Europe as perhaps it ever has. And, is still keeping us occupied, obviously, with this conflict in Ukraine and potentially threat to NATO. So perhaps some of these geopolitical struggles never truly end. And similarly, I think that even if you can envision the collapse of communism in China, which may or may not happen, may happen, if it does, centuries from now, potentially, right? And there's nothing that the United States can really do to hugely impact that. But that may not necessarily end our problems with China and its strive to be the world's preeminent power, which, by the way, believes it has a historic right to, because for much of human history, it was the world's most powerful nation, most populous, and only with the advent of the Industrial Revolution did it lose that mantle, first to Great Britain, and then to the United States. So I do think that China, even if you say, see the collapse of the Communist Party tomorrow, may remain a nationalistic power, a power that is intent on unification with Taiwan, a power that is intent on challenging the United States, as Russia is doing today, that is no longer communist, right? So I do think that this is a long game. It is a game ultimately about preserving American superpower status in the world, making sure that we have the world's greatest military, we have the world's biggest economy to enable us to manage all these different adversaries, which potentially may never go away. We hope one day, we would have more peaceful relations with all these countries, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, but it may not happen, right?
But it can. I mean, we look at Germany, we look at Japan. I mean, here we are.
They were defeated completely. There's no prospect, I think, for us invading Russia, invading China, changing their regimes, even Iran, North Korea. I don't think there's any appetite for those types of invasions like we did in Japan and Germany. Those types of wars, I think, hopefully are a sign of the past, because the cost is just absolutely catastrophic.
Well, if we play the cards right, then I mean the Soviet Union we won, but I take your point where Russia is. It's an interesting point that yes, we won the Cold War, but Russia has remained a problem even now that it's nationalist Russian entity as opposed to a communist Soviet entity, as opposed to winning World War II, where those countries were rebuilt entirely. I mean, I think that's an area. I think perhaps for further exploration, it's an interesting an argument, one that I certainly think more about. All right, we're at the end of our time here, Dmitri, and this is where we go to our lightning round. This is where you have to share with us your favorite Reagan speech, quote, and book. We'll take all three, two, or just one. What do you have?
All right, I have all three. So the favorite speech is the Point Duoc speech
yes.
on June 6, 1984. And the quote from that in particular is the one I particularly like, I think is very apt for today's time. President Reagan, in that famous speech on the anniversary of D-Day, the invasion of Normandy, said, "We in America have learned the bitter lessons from 2 world wars. It is better to be here, ready to protect the peace, than to take blind shelter across the sea, rushing to respond only after freedom is lost. We've learned that isolationism never was and never will be an acceptable response to tyrannical governments with an expansionist intent." I think very apropos for the debates we're having these days. The book, it's not quite a Reagan book, but it's a book that certainly has a lot on Reagan. It is written by my friend, historian Sergei Radchenko, called "To Run the World, the Kremlin's Cold War Bid for Global Power," which is a very interesting rewriting of the history of the Cold War, looking at the recently declassified documents from the Soviet archives and looking at what the Soviets were thinking at the time, all the way from the start of the Cold War in the 1940s, after World War II, till the very end, and presents a very interesting perspective on how they were thinking about this conflict.
Dmitri, thank you so much for being on the show. Thank you for discussing, and congratulations on your book, World on the Brink, How America Can Beat China in the Race for the 21st Century, a national bestseller. You can get it on Amazon. Really fun discussion. Thank you.